My name is Alina. I am 27 years old. I was born in a small town that never expected me to stay and never expected me to leave either. And I am writing this now because writing is the only thing that still moves forward when everything else keeps returning. I am not special. I was never brave. I was not chaste. I was not broken. I was just tired in a way that sleep does not fix. Tired of being known, tired of being expected, tired of waking up in the same shape every day and pretending that shape fit me. And when I finally decided to leave, it did not feel dramatic. It felt necessary, like breathing after holding my lungs full for too long. I did not tell anyone goodbye because goodbyes turn into anchors, and I did not want anything pulling me back. I chose America because America is wide and empty in places, and emptiness feels like permission. Long roads, skies that do not care about you, towns where your name only exists if you offer it, and I wanted to be unnamed for a while. I packed light clothes for a week, even though I did not know where I would stop. My notebook, my phone, the charger, and my old car, scratched, faded, but reliable, the only thing in my life that had never surprised me. I planned carefully, saved maps offline, marked gas stations, counted miles twice. I told myself preparation meant safety, that if something went wrong, it would not be my fault. But the day it started, the sky was already wrong. Flat, gray, unmoving, like a lid pressed down over the world. The clouds did not drift, they did not threaten rain, they simply stayed, and I drove beneath them for hours, watching the land stretch thinner, trees stepping farther apart, houses turning into barns, barns turning into nothing, cornfields ending without warning, like someone had erased the rest. And the radio refused to stay with me, every station slipping into static after a few seconds, like sound itself could not survive here. And eventually I turned it off because the static felt louder than silence, and that was when I noticed the road had gone quiet too. Not empty quiet, but absorbed, like my tires were rolling over something padded, something listening. And I remember laughing at myself because that thought was stupid, and fear likes to dress itself up as imagination. And the first time I saw the mile marker repeat, I ignored it. Mile 217, passing by again, like a misprint. Fatigue, distraction, something explainable. But the second time made me slow, and the third time made my stomach tighten, because everything around it matched exactly. The same fence, the same crack in the shoulder, the same dead grass. And when I checked my GPS, it told me to continue straight like it always had. And when I checked my fuel gauge, it was lower than it should have been. And panic did not arrive screaming. It arrived precise, because I knew how far my car could go. I had planned this stretch carefully, and when the fuel warning light came on anyway, that was when I saw the town on the map, no name, just a dot, and relief hit me so hard it almost hurt, because I told myself this was luck, a forgotten stop, a place too small to label, the kind of town that appears when you need it, and I do not remember seeing the sign until I was already passing it, white letters on green metal, Mile 0, you made it. And I laughed because it sounded like a joke, and because Mile 0 is where things begin, not where you arrive. And then the road dipped like it was bowing, and the town was there all at once. A gas station, a diner with one flickering light, a motel shaped like a horseshoe, every door facing the lot. Everything normal except for how still it was. No moving cars, no opening doors, only dust and waiting. And when I pulled into the gas station, the pump turned on before I touched it, and the screen lit up and said, "Welcome back," and something tight, unfamiliar closed around my chest. And inside the station, a man smiled at me like he had been expecting me, not surprised, not polite, relieved. And he said, "You made it just in time." And when I asked for what, he said, "For the night." and I did not like the way he said it, like the night was a thing that arrived with rules, and I paid for gas I do not remember pumping, and when I asked how to get back to the highway, he looked confused and said I was already on it, and when I drove out of town without turning, 10 minutes later I passed the same sign, Mile 0, you made it, and my fuel gauge was full, and that was when I understood the road was not looping, it was returning me, and I parked at the motel because there was nowhere else to go, and the clerk handed me a key and said, "Room's ready, Alina," even though I had never told her my name. And that night, lying on the bed, listening to footsteps stop just outside my door, I understood the truth I had been avoiding since the moment I arrived. This place did not stop people from leaving, it simply made leaving forgettable. I kept writing because stopping felt dangerous, like if my hand paused, the town would take that space and fill it with something else, and I did not want to find out what it would choose. So I wrote through the afternoon, through the strange, thin daylight that never quite shifted toward evening, and I noticed that time here did not move forward so much as it accumulated like dust, settling evenly over everything. And when I checked my phone again, the time had changed, but the light outside had not, and I wondered briefly if the town measured hours differently or if it simply reused them. And when hunger returned, I went back to the diner because patterns felt safer than choices, and the same woman poured the same coffee, and this time I watched her closely, the way her hand moved smoothly but without urgency, like she was repeating a remembered motion rather than performing a new one. And I asked her how long she had lived here, and she said, "A while." And when I asked where she came from, she said, "Here," and neither answer felt like a lie exactly, just incomplete, like the rest of the sentence had been removed. And I noticed then that the other people were still there, the same ones in the same booths, hands folded, eyes unfocused, plates untouched, and when one of them finally looked at me directly, his eyes were tired in a way that went beyond lack of sleep. Tired, like something had been worn thin. And when he spoke, his voice startled me, because it was the first unscripted sound I had heard all day. He said, "Don't rush it." And I asked, "Rush what?" And he shook his head slowly, like the motion itself hurt, and said, "That's how it gets you." And I wanted to ask, "Who gets you?" But the woman set a plate of food in front of me, and the smell made my thoughts scatter, and I realized I had not eaten since the day before. And when I took a bite, it tasted correct, comforting even, and that frightened me more than if it had been wrong, because it meant the town could still provide what I needed, and that implied expectation. And after I finished eating, I tried again to ask questions, but the answers slid away every time, like I was pressing on something smooth and rounded with no edges to grip. And outside the diner, the sky was finally darkening, but not smoothly. The light dimmed in steps, like someone turning down a dial, and the shadows sharpened too much too quickly, and people began to move then, quietly, efficiently, like night had granted permission, and I followed them at a distance, watching doors open and close, counting how many times I blinked between one action and the next, because blinking felt risky, like it might skip something important. And when I reached the motel again, the clerk was gone, and the office light was off, but my key still worked, and inside my room, the bedspread was tucked tighter than before, like someone had adjusted it while I was gone. And I stood very still, listening for any sound that would confirm I was not alone. And that was when I noticed the faint marks on the carpet just outside the bathroom. Not footprints exactly, more like the impression of someone who had stood there too long. And I backed away slowly, heart pounding, trying not to think about how long they had been there or why they had left. And that night, the footsteps returned, but closer this time, stopping directly outside my door, and I held my breath, counting the seconds, because fear here felt procedural, like it followed a schedule, and when the handle finally turned,
It did not open, it simply tested the latch gently once, like a reminder, and then the footsteps moved on, and I understood another rule without being told. The town does not force entry, it waits for invitation, and I did not sleep after that. I lay awake listening to the building breathe, listening to the subtle sounds of movement outside, like a tide going out. And when morning came, it arrived without warning, no gradual light, just sudden presence. And my phone said it was a different day, but the same date. And I knew then that if I did not leave a record, if I did not keep this thread unbroken, the town would begin to reorder me, and I would not notice until I could no longer remember why that mattered. And that is when I decided I would try again, not to escape yet, but to understand, because understanding felt like the only kind of movement still available to me here, and because somewhere beneath the fear, a quiet realization had taken root. This place had not appeared by accident, and neither had I.
I learned the rules by breaking them because no one here ever states them out loud, and I think that is intentional because rules spoken can be argued with, and rules discovered feel like truths. And the first rule I learned was that questions have weight, because every time I asked one, the town answered somewhere else. Not to me directly, but to the space around me, like a light flickering, or a door unlocking, or a clock correcting itself. And I began to understand that information here moved laterally, not forward, and that if I wanted answers, I would have to learn how to watch instead of ask. And so I watched the way people crossed the street, only at certain points even though there were no signs, the way no one ever entered a building before someone inside looked at them first, the way conversations ended when a third person approached, like 3 was too many, and I noticed that no one ever said goodbye. They said see you or later or simply nodded, like language here avoided endings, and that made sense because endings imply exits, and exits were sensitive, and I tested this carefully, the way you test thin ice by tapping with your foot before committing weight. And when I said goodbye to the woman in the diner, her smile tightened just enough for me to see it, and later that day the door to my motel room stuck for several seconds longer than usual, and I understood the warning and adjusted. And I began to write the rules down in my notebook, but I stopped after a few pages because the words began to blur together, and I realized the town did not like being itemized because lists imply mastery, and mastery implies threat. And instead, I started writing them as observations folded into memory, like the way you remember how to swim without remembering the lesson itself. And the second rule revealed itself slowly, that staying still too long invites attention, because when I lingered in one place, the air around me thickened and sounds dulled, and someone always appeared nearby pretending not to watch. And the third rule came at night when I noticed the windows across from the motel never showed darkness, only reflections, like mirrors held up to the room behind me, and when I moved, the reflection moved too, precisely, and I understood that looking outward here was also a kind of looking inward. And the fourth rule was the hardest, because it felt like kindness, which made it dangerous. The town gives you what you need just before you realize you need it, and once that happens, the need belongs to the town, not to you. And I experienced this when my notebook began refilling itself with blank pages after I reached the end, and I did not remember buying a new one. And I told myself not to be grateful, because gratitude binds. And I went to the grocery store that evening and found my favorite brand of cereal on the shelf, something I had not eaten since childhood, and my throat tightened, because memory here was a tool, and nostalgia was a handle. And as I left the store, the man from the diner passed me and said, "Careful what you accept, it remembers." And I asked him what happens if you refuse, and he said you learn how heavy wanting can be. And that night, I broke another rule without meaning to, because I dreamed again, and this time the dream showed me a version of the town with roads leading out in every direction, signs pointing toward places with names I recognized. And when I woke, I felt hope sharp and immediate, and that was my mistake, because hope here is loud, and the town heard it. And the next morning, one of the roads was gone, not blocked, not closed, simply absent, like it had never existed, and no one else reacted. And I understood then the final rule of Mile Zero, the one that no one survives breaking twice. The town does not punish defiance, it removes possibility. And as I wrote this, my hand shook because I realized I had been mapping the rules not to escape, but to endure. And that knowledge settled in me heavily, because endurance is how you become permanent, and permanence is what this place trades in. And somewhere in the quiet after that thought, the town seemed to lean closer, like it was listening to see if I would correct myself. And I did not know if I could anymore.
I started noticing them once I knew to look, the people who carried a different weight, the ones whose eyes tracked movement even when their bodies stayed still, and whose hands twitched like they were remembering something they were no longer allowed to do. And they were not rare, but they were quiet, clustered at the edges of places, never quite centered, never fully absent. And I realized these were the ones who had almost left, because almost leaving leaves a residue, and the town tolerated it, the way a body tolerates scar tissue. And I spoke to them carefully, one at a time, never asking directly, because directness here closes doors. And I learned their stories sideways, fragments offered like contraband. A woman who remembered an ocean she could not place, a man who still dreamed in another language, a couple who argued every night about a city neither of them could find on a map, and the pattern was consistent. They all described a moment where the town loosened its grip just enough to be convincing, an unlocked door, a road that stayed straight, a sign that promised distance, and each of them said the same thing without realizing it. They hesitated not out of fear, but out of relief, because leaving meant returning to wanting, and staying meant quiet. And the town exploits that difference, because relief is easier to maintain than desire. And one of them, a man named Evan, though I was not sure the name still belonged to him, told me he had made it as far as mile 12 before the road softened beneath his tires. And he said it felt like driving over a memory instead of pavement, and he turned back because he was afraid of what would happen if the memory ran out. And when I asked him what he lost when he returned, he frowned, like the question itself hurt, and said, "I don't know, but something stopped hurting." And that scared me more than any monster could, because pain leaves when it is no longer needed. And I began to understand that the town does not trap everyone all at once. It thins you gradually, removing friction until movement feels unnecessary. And I watched how these almost leavers behaved. They stayed busy. They took on tasks no one asked them to do. They fixed things that did not need fixing, because motion of any kind was still motion. And at night, they sat together outside the diner, not speaking but existing near each other, like warmth shared. And I joined them one evening, and no one acknowledged me directly, but someone slid a chair closer, and that was invitation enough. And we sat there, watching the road, the one road that led out, and I realized then that no one watched it hoping to leave. They watched it hoping it would change. And when I asked if anyone had ever fully escaped, the answer came from 3 mouths at once. Someone did. And then silence closed around the statement like a door, and I did not push because pressure here has consequences. But that night I lay awake thinking about that someone and what it meant that the town allowed the story to exist, because stories that circulate serve a purpose, and hope, even dangerous hope, is still a tool. And I wondered if that was why I was here, not to escape, but to remember how. And the thought felt both empowering and like a trap, because purpose here is assigned, not chosen. And before sleep finally took me, I wrote down the names of everyone I had spoken to, even the ones I was not sure were correct. because names resist erosion. And as I wrote, I noticed my own name looked unfamiliar on the page, like it belonged to someone else, and I understood with a slow, cold clarity that almost leaving had already begun to change me, and the town had noticed, because outside my window, the road light flickered once like an eye closing and opening, and I knew then that part 4 of this story is where I stopped being a visitor and became a variable.
Night in Mile Zero is not an absence of light, it is a change in permissions. And I learned that the first evening I stayed awake long enough to watch the town switch modes. Because dusk does not arrive here gradually, it settles like a decision. And when it does, the town exhales, and things that were paused resume, and things that moved freely during the day slow down. And I realized quickly that night belongs to the town in a way day does not, because during the day people behave like individuals, but at night they behave like parts of a system. And I saw this when doors opened in sequence, not together, but with deliberate spacing, like beats in a pattern. And people stepped out, not speaking, not looking around, just moving to where they were meant to be. And I followed at a distance, careful not to draw attention, because night punishes curiosity more directly. And we gathered without gathering outside the diner, the gas station, the church, each place filled to a certain capacity and no more, and no one questioned where they stood, like the town had already arranged them. And I noticed that the almost leavers clustered together again, but closer this time, and I felt myself pulled toward them without choosing to move, and that frightened me, because it meant alignment had begun. And the road at night looks different too, narrower, less solid, like it is borrowing shape from memory instead of asphalt. And I understood why Evan turned back at mile 12, because the farther out you go, the more the road asks you to supply what it no longer provides. And then the sounds began, low and steady, a hum that did not come from machines or voices, but from the ground itself, like vibration trapped under the surface, and everyone stilled as if listening to instructions. And I realized then that the town does not sleep, because sleeping would imply vulnerability, and instead it dreams collectively. And we were inside that dream, and something passed through the street, not walking, not driving, just moving like a change in pressure, and I could not see it directly, but I saw its effect, shadows bending, sound thinning, people leaning slightly toward it like plants toward light, and my chest tightened because I knew instinctively that this was what enforced the rules, not a creature, not a watcher, but a process. And when it passed, the town resumed movement, but differently, softer, more compliant, and conversations afterward were quieter, shorter, like language itself had been edited. And I asked one of the almost leavers what had just happened, and he shook his head and said, "Night maintenance," and did not elaborate. And later, back in my room, I noticed my reflection lagging again in the mirror by half a second, just enough to feel intentional, and I understood that night is when the town checks its inventory, and that includes people and memories and intentions. And I slept fitfully, dreaming of standing still while the world adjusted around me. And when morning came, I felt tired in a way sleep does not fix. And I knew then that enduring the night costs something, even if you do not know what payment was taken. And as I wrote this, my hand cramped, and I wondered briefly if writing at night marked me as inefficient, and that thought terrified me, because usefulness here is survival. And I ended part 5 knowing one thing with certainty. I stopped trusting directions once I realized maps here did not lie, they interpreted, and interpretation implies intention. And intention belongs to the thing doing the reading and not the thing being read. And the first map to betray me was my own, the one I had saved offline, marked with careful notes and distances that had once made sense.
because when I opened it, the town appeared slightly larger than it had the day before. Not expanded, just clarified, like details had been filled in that I did not remember drawing, and roads that should have ended now curved gently back toward the center. And I told myself it was a glitch, because glitches can be fixed. But when I asked the man at the gas station if he sold maps, he laughed softly and said, "Which version?" And that answer settled something in me uncomfortably, because it meant there were multiple truths available, and choosing one mattered. And later that day, I found a folded paper map in my jacket pocket, one I had not owned before, yellowed at the edges, creased in places that suggested repeated use. And when I opened it, the town was smaller, fewer buildings, fewer roads, a simpler shape, like a memory from earlier in its life. And at the bottom, in handwriting that looked too much like mine, were the words, "This one remembers you." And I felt a chill, because memory here is not passive, it is directional. And that night, I spread every map I could find across the motel bed. My phone, my notebook sketches, the paper map, the crude diagram Evan once drew for me on a napkin, and none of them agreed exactly, but all of them shared one feature. Every road pointed inward eventually. And I realized then that the problem was not navigation, it was orientation, because leaving assumes an outside, and mile zero is not built around edges, it is built around return. And once I understood that, the town seemed to relax around me. Doors opened a little faster, conversations lingered longer, and I knew that meant I had stopped threatening it, because understanding is a form of alignment, and alignment is what the town rewards. And that frightened me enough that I tried to break it deliberately, by drawing my own map, one that included a straight line leading out, no curve, no return. And as I drew it, my head began to ache sharply, like pressure behind the eyes, and the pencil snapped in my hand, and the pain vanished instantly. And I understood the warning, because the town does not stop you from imagining escape, it stops you from recording it. And that night, the dream returned but changed. I was driving again, following a map that kept erasing itself behind me. And when I woke, my paper map was gone, and in its place lay a new one. Cleaner, more detailed, more accurate, and I did not need to look closely to know it had been updated to include me. And that was when I understood the final truth of the map problem. Maps here do not show you where you can go, they show you who you are allowed to be. And as I folded it carefully and put it away, I felt something in me settle, like a decision being made without my permission. And I knew then that part 6 was where the town finished learning how I thought and began adjusting accordingly.
I noticed the changes in my body before I admitted what they meant, because bodies tell the truth long before the mind is willing to listen, and the first thing that changed was sleep, which stopped behaving like rest and started behaving like an event. Because some nights I closed my eyes and nothing happened at all. Hours passed without sensation, without dreams, without the relief of waking. And other nights I slept so deeply it felt like I had been powered down and restarted, and I woke with impressions that did not belong to me. Soreness in places I had not strained, dirt beneath my fingernails, the faint metallic taste of blood, though my mouth was uninjured, and hunger followed the same pattern. Some days I ate constantly, without satisfaction, and other days I forgot food entirely until dizziness reminded me, and the town accommodated both without comment. The diner serving meals at any hour, the grocery shelves refilling themselves with items that matched my cravings too precisely, and I realized then that my body was being read like a form and adjusted accordingly. And pain became selective. Small injuries healed too quickly, while old aches I had learned to ignore began to fade like they were no longer necessary. And that scared me more than injury, because pain is a record, and erasing it implies revision, and I began marking myself subtly, small scratches on my arm, a bruise pressed into existence just to see if they remained, and some did and some did not, and the ones that faded left behind find a strange smoothness, like skin that had never known damage, and I stopped testing after I woke one morning to find a scar from childhood completely gone, and I could not remember how I got it, and that gap in memory felt deeper than the absence itself. And people noticed the changes, even if they did not comment directly. The clerk looking at me a second longer than usual, the woman at the diner asking if I felt lighter yet, and the almost leavers watching me with something like recognition. And one of them whispered, "It's starting." And I asked, "What?" And she said, "The adjustment." And I asked, "Adjustment to what?" And she shook her head like the question itself hurt, and walked away. And that night, as I lay awake listening to the town breathe, I realized my heartbeat had slowed. Not dangerously, not obviously, just enough that counting it took effort. And I wondered briefly if the town was sinking me to something larger, a rhythm beneath the road, beneath the buildings. And the thought made my chest tighten, because synchronization is how systems incorporate new parts. And in the morning, I caught my reflection in the motel mirror, and for a moment did not recognize it, not because my face had changed, but because the expression felt practiced, like something I had worn many times before and forgotten. And I touched the glass to confirm it was still solid, and that simple reassurance felt necessary in a way it never had before. And as I wrote this down, my handwriting shifted slightly, smoother, more confident, less hesitant, and I tried to force it back to how it used to look, but my hand resisted. And that frightened me enough that I wrote my name again and again across the page until it felt familiar. And even then, I was not sure if familiarity meant ownership or repetition. And somewhere outside, the footsteps returned, not stopping at my door this time, but passing by in a steady rhythm. And I understood that part 7 is where the town stopped working around my body and started working through it, and the realization settled in me quietly, because by then, quiet had become the most dangerous thing of all.
It happened without announcement, which is how real changes occur here, because announcements invite resistance, and resistance is inefficient. And I only noticed because the absence felt sharper than presence ever had. And the first sign was the bench outside the diner where Evan used to sit, now empty even at the hours when someone should have been there. And the second sign was the way people avoided looking at the road that morning, like eye contact with it might reopen a wound. And when I asked where Evan was, no one answered directly. They said things like, "He finished," or "He went far enough," or simply nodded, like the information was already complete and did not require language. And the town itself seemed altered in response. The air lighter, the hum beneath the ground quieter, like a machine cycling down after a successful operation. And I understood then that someone leaving was not a rupture, it was a process completing. And that terrified me because it meant escape was not rebellion, it was participation, and I needed to know how it happened, not to copy it yet, but to understand the cost. And that knowledge did not come from the people who stayed, it came from the things that changed afterward. Evan's room at the motel cleaned out too thoroughly, the notebook he used to carry gone, the grocery shelf missing the brand of crackers he always bought, and most disturbing of all, the memory of his face already softening at the edges in my mind, like an image left too long in the sun. And I forced myself to write everything I remembered about him down immediately, the sound of his voice, the way he leaned forward when he spoke, the exact phrasing he used when he said mile 12. And as I wrote, the words resisted me, my hand slowing, my thoughts drifting, and I realized the town was not erasing him, it was allowing him to fade naturally, because forgetting is easier than removal. And that night, the almost leavers gathered without planning, sitting together like they always did, but quieter. And one of them said, "He paid more than we thought." And another said, "Maybe that's what it takes." And I asked what he paid, and the answer came from someone I had never spoken to before, someone whose face I could not recall even as I looked at it. They said, "Continuity." And I felt cold, because continuity is what makes a self survivable, and without it, movement becomes meaningless.
and when I returned to my room, I found my door unlocked, even though I was certain I had locked it, and on the bed lay a folded piece of paper, not a map, not a note, just a receipt from the gas station dated 2 days from now, and I did not need to read the total to understand the implication, because time here bends for those who are almost ready, and the town had just shown me proof that leaving was possible, but not without payment. And the worst part was that some part of me wanted to know what it would take, because wanting here is contagious, and I felt it spreading through me like warmth. And as I lay awake that night listening to the road, I realized I was no longer afraid of being trapped. I was afraid of being finished. And that was when I understood that Part 8 is not about escape at all. It is about
The offer does not arrive as words, because words can be refused, and what Mile Zero offers is structured so refusal feels unnecessary. And I realized this the morning after Evan left, when the clerk slid a cup of coffee toward me that I had not ordered, and said, "You're close now," without looking at me. And I asked, "Close to what?" And she smiled with the patience reserved for people who were almost aligned, and said, "Close enough." And that answer stayed with me all day, echoing in the empty spaces between tasks, because the town began giving me small permissions, things it had never done before. The road stayed straight an extra mile longer. The radio held a station through an entire song. The diner ran out of my favorite food and did not replace it immediately. And these absences felt intentional, like tests of tolerance, and I passed them without trying, because I was tired of pushing, and that scared me, because effortlessness here is a sign of progress, and in the afternoon I noticed numbers appearing everywhere, not written, not displayed, just present, counts that made sense without explanation. 3 people at the counter, 4 cars in the lot, 12 steps between my room and the ice machine, and I realized the town was counting me, or maybe I was learning how to count the way it did, and when I tried to ignore it, the numbers grew louder, not auditory but insistent, like a thought you can't stop having. And that night, I dreamed of a scale, not weighing mass, but sequence, memories on one side, repetitions on the other, and the scale tipped only when I removed something I loved and left it behind. And when I woke, I knew what the offer was, not escape, not freedom, but simplification. Mile Zero offers relief from complexity, from wanting, from the exhausting work of continuity, and all it asks in return is subtraction. And I understood then why some people leave and some stay, because both are outcomes, both are acceptable resolutions to the system, and the town does not care which one you choose, as long as you choose cleanly. And I began counting my own memories, testing which ones felt heavy, which ones slid away easily, and that was the most dangerous moment so far, because choice became tangible, and when choice becomes tangible, consent follows. And as I write this now, I am aware of how many parts remain, how the road will change, how something will stay, how this will end, and that awareness feels like standing at mile 12 with the pavement softening beneath my tires and knowing that turning back would be easier, but continuing would be simpler, and I do not yet know which one I am afraid of. The road moves when you stop thinking of it as a road, and that realization came to me slowly, painfully, like learning a new muscle exists by straining it. And the first time I noticed it happening, I was not even trying to leave. I was just driving, because movement still feels like agency even when it isn't. And the pavement ahead of me began to feel soft, not visibly, not dramatically, just subtly, like it was adjusting its density to my expectations. And the car did not jolt or slow, it simply continued. And the horizon shifted closer without actually approaching, and I understood then that distance here is negotiated, not measured, and the road was not looping or returning anymore. It was editing itself in real time, responding to my thoughts like a sentence being rewritten as it is spoken. And I laughed once, short and sharp, because that is what you do when fear finds a new shape. And the radio clicked on without static, and the voice that came through was my own, reading a passage I had not written yet. And I slammed it off because hearing yourself ahead of yourself is disorienting in a way that scrambles cause and effect. And the mile markers were gone, replaced by something worse, nothing at all. No indicators, no reassurance, just continuation. And that is when panic finally arrived. Not loud, not explosive, but total. Because without markers, there is no proof of progress. And without proof, progress becomes faith. And faith here is currency. And I did not want to spend it blindly. And I tried to turn around, but turning implies orientation, and orientation was already compromised, and the wheel responded with a delay just long enough to feel intentional, and the road curved gently, not back, not forward, but inward, like it was folding space around me, and I realized that the road does not move. You move the road by believing it will hold you, and that belief had been growing quietly in me for days. And I felt betrayed by my own adaptability, because adaptation is what the town cultivates best. And I thought of Evan and Mile 12 and the softening pavement, and I wondered if he had noticed the same thing, or if for him it had felt natural, like relief finally arriving. And that thought hurt, because it meant escape might feel like giving in, and staying might feel like resistance. And the difference between the two was becoming impossible to define. And eventually I stopped the car, because stopping is still allowed. And the road did not end or reset, it simply waited. And I sat there, engine running, counting breaths, counting seconds, counting the space between thoughts. And I realized the road was waiting for input, for intention, for direction, not geographic, but existential. And I did not give it any, because giving it anything would mean accepting the premise. And after a long time, the car behind me honked once, even though I had seen no one pass me. And when I looked in the mirror, there was no car, just the impression of expectation. And I drove back to town, because return is always available. And the moment the first building came into view, the road hardened again, like it was relieved to be done negotiating. And the town welcomed me without comment, because it already knew what had happened. And as I parked, I felt a deep exhaustion, not physical but structural, like something inside me had been bent and not fully returned to shape. And I understood then that Part 10 is not about leaving or staying. It is about learning that the path itself is conditional. And once you know that, you can never again pretend that roads are neutral or that movement is innocent, because here, even the act of going somewhere asks you who you are willing to become in order to arrive. Staying is not the opposite of leaving here. It is its own action with its own cost and its own shape. And I began to understand what stays by watching what does not disappear when someone goes. Because absence is loud at first, but permanence is quieter and more insistent. And the things that stayed after Evan left were not his belongings or his routines, but the adjustments made for him. A slightly longer pause at the diner door, the bench still positioned to catch the late afternoon light, the extra chair that no one moved even when space was tight. And I realized the town does not erase people, it redistributes them, breaking them down into habits and allowances and negative space. And that frightened me, because it meant staying does not preserve you, it preserves your function. And slowly I noticed which parts of me the town seemed interested in keeping: my ability to observe, my patience, my willingness to adapt, my need to write, and the things it ignored: my anger, my nostalgia, my sharpest griefs. And those ignored parts began to dull, like tools left unused. And I fought that dulling by remembering deliberately, by replaying moments from before the road, the town, the mile marker, repeating my life when distance still behaved and memory still resisted. And some of those memories held their shape, while others slid away no matter how tightly I held them. And I learned to recognize the difference. The ones that stayed were not the happiest or the most painful. They were the ones that had changed me, because change leaves an imprint that even this place respects. And I understood then why the almost leavers clung to small tasks and shared silence, because staying requires anchoring yourself to change rather than desire. And the town encourages this by rewarding consistency, by smoothing days, by reducing friction and making time feel evenly distributed. And I found myself waking at the same moment each morning without an alarm, my body settling into a rhythm that matched the underlying hum. And I hated how easy it felt, because ease here is not kindness, it is efficiency. And one evening, as I sat outside watching the road, I realized I was no longer watching it for escape or hope. I was watching it out of familiarity, like you watch something that has shaped you, even if it has harmed you. And that realization cut deep, because it meant some part of me had already stayed and was learning to be comfortable with that fact. And when I wrote that sentence, my hand did not shake, and that scared me more than anything else so far, because fear is proof of resistance, and its absence feels like surrender. And I began to suspect that the town does not need to trap you forever. It only needs to keep you long enough that staying becomes one of the things that stays. And once that happens, leaving becomes possible, but irrelevant, because you would carry the structure with you and recreate it wherever you went. And that is the real containment, not walls or roads or loops, but habits and tolerances, and the quiet acceptance of less. And as I write this, part 11, I am aware that there is only one part left, and that awareness feels heavy, because endings here are not conclusions, they are integrations, and I do not know yet which parts of me will stay when this story ends, or whether writing it has already decided that for me. But I do know this: the town is still here, the road is still listening, and something in me has stopped asking when and started asking how. And that shift may be the most permanent thing of all.
I am still writing, because writing is the only motion here that has not been fully accounted for. And I do not know if that is because the town cannot read intention fast enough when it is buried in language, or because stories move differently than bodies. But I know this: every time I stop writing for too long, something inside me loosens. Not snaps, not breaks, just loosens, like a knot left unattended. And when that happens, the town feels closer, not physically, but conceptually, like it is waiting for me to finish a sentence so it can complete it for me. And I will not give it that satisfaction, because completion is its preferred state, and I have learned that unfinished things retain power. And that is why I am telling this story without pause, without rest, without space, because pauses invite adjustment, and space invites filling, and I have seen how easily that happens here, how gaps are treated as opportunities. And I think back to the beginning, to the road that felt quiet, to the sign that said, "Mile 0, you made it." And I understand now that it was not mocking me, it was informing me that arrival is not a single moment, it is a condition. And once you meet it, you are inside the system that measures progress by reduction and comfort by sameness. And I write to remember sequence, because sequence is fragile here. Events reorder themselves based on meaning rather than time. And if I stop writing, I am afraid the order will soften like the road did, and I will not know which version of myself came first. And I need that knowledge, because identity depends on continuity, and continuity is the highest price this place demands. And I have seen what happens to those who pay it, and those who do not, and neither outcome feels like victory, but one of them allows for narrative, and narrative is still mine as long as I am holding it. And I have considered leaving again. I have stood at the edge of town with my keys in my hand and felt the road respond, but I have not gone because I am not certain that leaving while carrying this place inside me would be any different from staying. And that uncertainty keeps me here, keeps me writing, because as long as I am documenting, I am not resolved, and unresolved things resist integration. And maybe that is the real reason the town tolerates me. Maybe it needs a witness. Maybe every system needs someone to observe it imperfectly, to introduce noise into the pattern. And if that is my role, then I will accept it, because roles can be abandoned later, even if they feel permanent now. And if you are reading this, then understand this is not a warning and not an invitation. It is a record, and records persist differently than people do. And if you ever see a sign that says mile 0, you made it, remember that arrival is not success, and staying is not failure, and leaving is not freedom. They are all negotiations, and the most important thing you can do is keep track of yourself while you decide, because forgetting is the only outcome here that cannot be reversed. And I am still writing, because as long as I am writing, I know who comes next, and for now, that is enough.